Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Science on the Edge podcast. I'm Dr. Mark Darcy, and today I'm going to be recording a podcast that I've been thinking about doing for some time. It's a very controversial subject. It's evolution by natural selection. Now, there's a lot of misinformation out there. Just scrolling the internet, and especially social media, you hear so many people saying that there's not really any evidence for evolution, or evolution is just a theory, and as such could be falsified at any point. Well, yes, evolution is a theory, but in science, theories have evidence, and evolution has got pretty much as much evidence for it as gravity. It is an incredibly strong theory with so much evidence, from fossil evidence to genetic evidence, proteomics evidence. There's just so much, and I'm going to go through that evidence to just explain it, explain what evolution is, how it was discovered, the evidence. I'll go through the evidence in depth. I'll explain the different kinds of evolution and why they occur. I'll also spend a bit of time talking about human evolution. But before I get started, I'd just like to say that I really enjoy putting together these podcasts. But if you enjoy them too, you might want to consider going to my website, scienceontheedge.com, and clicking on the donate button. If you donate just a couple of dollars, it will help keep me motivated to make these episodes. I enjoy making them, but a bit of extra motivation is always welcome. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so we're going to talk about variation, adaptation, and evolution. So evolution by natural selection. I'm sure you all know about this guy, Charles Darwin. He was an English naturalist. He noticed that there were many similarities between different species. He believed that these similarities pointed to a common ancestry, and that new species form by gradual changes over the generations. Charles Darwin and another English naturalist, Alfred Wallace, proposed natural selection as the mechanism by which the most successful changes are passed on, allowing organisms to evolve to suit their environment. So how did Charles Darwin come up with this idea? Well, Charles Darwin, as a young man, here's a picture of him as an older man, but when he was a young man, he almost went into the church. This was a sort of family tradition. But he was very interested in botany, which was just a catch-all term in the early 19th century for biology, everything from plants to animals to mushrooms to insects. He always had an interest in nature, in naturalism, in botany. So he decided to take that route. As a young man, he studied biology at length, but he really wanted to travel around the world. He wanted to see life, see nature in other parts of the globe. But that wasn't so easy to do back then. He was a middle-class gentleman, but you couldn't just buy a round-the-world ticket in the early 19th century. But he was in luck. You see, a particularly famous explorer, Captain Cook, was about to embark on a trip to map South America, to map the entire coast in meticulous detail. And the thing is, Captain Cook didn't want to spend several years, which is what it would take to map South America. Remember, this is a time of sailing ships before steam. He didn't want to spend his trip just stuck with a bunch of uneducated sailors. So he put an advertisement out in a national newspaper asking for a traveling companion, someone who would get free board and travel in return for just keeping him company during the trip. Charles Darwin saw this advertisement and he applied, and he got the job. Something that he pretty much immediately regretted, actually, because it turns out Charles Darwin suffered from seasickness. Didn't know that until he set foot on that ship, and it was too late. The voyage was several years long, and he spent a lot of that trip feeling unwell. But in one way, this was a good thing, because it meant whenever they came to port on dry land, he would leap off that ship and he would spend as much time as possible just exploring the local area, making drawings of the animals and the plants that he saw, and gradually coming up with his idea of evolution by natural selection. He saw that there were many different animals in different parts of the world, and they all seemed to be ideally suited to their particular ecological niche. So wherever they were, they seemed perfect for that particular location. For example, he went to the Galapagos Islands off the coast of South America. There are many Galapagos Islands, but they have slightly different climates. So on one island, maybe you have lots of insects. On another, you have very few insects, but maybe you have a lot of seeds. On another, maybe you have quite a bit of fruit and berries. The different islands had different climates, and therefore different vegetation and different animal life. One thing that he noticed, though, was on those islands, there were also different varieties of finch. Finch is a small bird. He noticed that on the island, for example, where there are many insects, the finches had a very thin beak that was perfect for catching insects. On the island where the only real foodstuff for the finches was seeds, small seeds, the finches had shorter, stubbier beaks that were perfect for crushing these seeds. And a different beak shape again on the islands where the main food source was grubs that lived in trees. So all these finches had a different shaped beak that was perfect for catching the food on that particular island. We also noticed was a kind of generic finch that lived in South America. Its beak shape was somewhere in between the beak shapes of the finches on the individual Galapagos Islands. This is where he came up with the idea that maybe once there were no finches on the Galapagos Islands, and then there was a storm, and a flock of finches maybe was blown across from the mainland, from South America to the Galapagos Islands. They're a little way away, but every now and then this would happen. And then they found themselves on these different islands with different foodstuffs. This created a selection pressure, as he coined the phrase. The selection pressures were different on different islands. So, for example, imagine there's the island where the main foodstuff is insects. Now, the finches that initially colonized that island, the beaks were sort of in between shape, not ideal for catching insects. But there is variation in every generation. Each sibling is a little bit different from each other. We have genetic variation amongst our species, and that was true of the finches too. So the group of finches on that particular island, some had a slightly thicker, shorter beak, some had a slightly longer, thinner beak. Now, the finches that had a beak that was that little bit better at catching insects would prosper on that island. They would find more insects, eat more insects, grow bigger and stronger, find more mates, and pass on their genes for a longer, thinner beak to the next generation. The individuals whose beaks were not so ideal for catching insects would not prosper quite so well, not grow up quite so big and strong, not find as many mates, and pass fewer of their genes to the next generation. Now, in one generation, this doesn't make much difference. But in the next generation, on average, the finch population on that island would have slightly thinner, longer beaks. But this would occur again in the next generation, and the next, and the next, and the next, and the next. Fast forward many generations, throw in the odd random mutation that would occasionally give a finch an even longer, thinner beak, and you end up with the evolution by natural selection of a population of finches that all have long, thin beaks, absolutely perfect for catching insects. The selection pressure in this case is the foodstuff. Now, let's go across to another island, perhaps the island where the foodstuff are small seeds. Now, having a long, thin beak doesn't help you to find the small seeds and to eat them. Having a short, stubby beak does. Now, initially, the population have all got intermediate beaks, but the odd finch would have a slightly shorter, slightly stronger beak than the rest, and would be more ideally suited to finding and eating these small seeds. So it would grow bigger and stronger, find more mates, and pass on its genes for a smaller, stubbier beak to the next generation. So in the next generation, there will be more of the population with shorter, stubbier beaks. This would occur again in the next generation, and again and again and again and again. The odd mutation would be thrown in, giving the occasional finch an even shorter, stubbier, stronger beak. And when you fast forward enough generations, you end up with an island population of finches that all have very short, very stubby, very strong beaks, perfectly for catching seeds. So on these two islands now, we still have finches. They are still the same species, but they are now different varieties of finches. If these finches were separated for long enough, they would adapt even more to their local surroundings, perhaps to the point where they become separate species. So he had this idea, and he didn't just apply this idea to finches, he applied this idea to every animal and plant he came across. He postulated that somewhere in the past there were ancestral populations of animals and plants which changed and diverged as they spread around the world and were exposed to different selection pressures, such as temperature, such as different foodstuffs, such as the amount of water availability, etc., etc. So he mapped this idea, went back to the UK, and then sat on this idea for 20 years. He sat on the idea because, well, he was a shy man and he didn't want controversy, and the country was still very religious back in the 19th century. It was thought that God created heaven and earth and all the plants and animals on it in 7 days. And he didn't want to rock the boat. He was a shy man. He feared that there would be a lot of controversy if he published his findings. So he sat on them. He carried on gathering evidence, though. He gathered evidence over the next several years for his theory, but he didn't publish. He did, however, still become relatively famous as a naturalist. He published on many other topics, everything from snails to various plants, etc. He loved biology, wrote huge amounts on different topics relating to biology, but not on evolution. Until one day, Alfred Wallace, another English biologist who was working over in Malaysia, independently came up with the same idea, this idea of natural selection. And he wrote to Charles Darwin with his idea. This prompted Charles Darwin to finally publish his findings. Just as a side note, when Charles Darwin did publish, he became very famous almost overnight. A lot of the controversy that he predicted did happen. The church did not generally like his idea. Even in the scientific community, there were many people that were against the idea, usually religious type people. But the theory was strong and no one could disprove it. Meanwhile, Alfred Wallace, I'm afraid, because he didn't get credit for this theory, he sort of faded into obscurity and died in poverty. Charles Darwin, however, became world famous. He published his work in a book called On the Origin of Species, which was a bestseller and is still in print today. Okay, so here's Darwin's assumptions. One, there are inheritable variations among the members of a population. Many more individuals are produced each generation than can survive and reproduce. Individuals with adaptive characteristics are more likely to be selected to reproduce by the environment. So gradually, over long periods of time, a population can become well adapted to a particular environment. The end result of this organic evolution is many different species, each adapted to specific environments. So Darwin assumed that sometime in the distant past, there was some primordial ancestral life form, some very simple life form that spread around the world, changing as it was exposed to different selection pressures, and gradually over many millions of years produced every type of animal and plant that exists today. There were a couple of worries at the time regarding this theory because it was thought the Earth was much younger than we currently know it to be. So it didn't seem to be quite enough time for this to occur. However, now we know that the Earth is actually very old, and life has been present on this planet for at least 3.5, 4 billion years. So there's been plenty of time for this evolution by natural selection to occur. Now, there was quite a lot of evidence for evolution, which I'll get to shortly. So to summarize Darwin's main points, offspring generally appear similar to parents. No two individuals are identical. Organisms that have the ability to produce large numbers of offspring tend to survive and prosper. Not all the offspring do. Populations in nature tend to remain fairly stable, you see. So there's a competition between individuals, and the fittest survive. By fittest, I should clarify that term. A lot of people believe that survival of the fittest means survival of the biggest and the strongest. This is where the eugenics movement and the Nazi movement got things completely wrong. It's not about being bigger and stronger and more aggressive. In some environments it is, in others it's not. You see, perhaps if you're a tiger, that works as a survival trait. But if you're a social species like a human, the biggest, strongest, most aggressive will probably not actually do that well in the long run. You see, if there's an individual in a social species like humans that is constantly throwing his weight around, being aggressive, being violent, hurting other members of the tribe, then back in the hunter-gathering times, what would probably happen is one day everyone would go out hunting and that individual wouldn't come back. There would be some terrible accident with a predator, basically meaning the rest of the tribe would just put him out of their misery. In a social species like humans, fittest means best able to form networks, to form bonds, to share your ideas, get people to follow you, etc. in a group. That doesn't mean the biggest and the strongest necessarily. Fit means different things in different environments. Even with humans, the fittest in a savanna environment are the tallest and the thinnest individuals, because they can cover all the big distance in the savanna relatively quickly, find food sources, find water sources, avoid predators, see the predators coming over the horizon. That is the fittest in a savanna environment. In a jungle, however, the fittest for a human is the shortest. Short individuals in dense jungle can move through the jungle quicker, find food quicker, and therefore find mates, be healthy, pass on their short genes to the next generation. So the selection pressure in a jungle is to get smaller, in a savanna to get taller. So selection pressures are different in different environments. So what evidence is there for evolution? Well, the first and most obvious piece of evidence is the fossil record. The further you dig down into the ground, the further back in time you go. The simplest organisms are found in the oldest rocks, and then older species seem to become extinct and are replaced by new species over time. And some species seem to change from one form to another. So certain species of reptiles evolving into the bird, for example, and various primitive organisms, proto-species evolving into modern species. For example, by digging down in the ground, you can see the progenitors of modern horses. You can see the entire evolutionary tree that led from primitive, non-horse-like organisms up to the modern horse and zebra. You can also see human evolution in progress. The farther back in time you go, the more primitive the human fossils are, until they're no longer recognizable as modern humans. You go back from Homo sapiens to archaic Homo sapiens, to Homo heidelbergensis, to Homo erectus, to the Australopithecines, and then to simple organisms that are more like a chimpanzee. So we can see by just digging down, the fossils change form over time. Now, this evidence alone is pretty conclusive. You can see the evolution of species just by digging down into the ground. And this evidence was available to Charles Darwin at the time. But there was more evidence. First of all, biochemical evidence. Similar biochemistry of all living things. Closely related species seem to have similar biochemistry. The longer ago they diverged, the more different the biochemistry seems to be. Amino acid sequences in molecules such as cytochrome C, which is in the mitochondria and used in respiration. Species with the same amino acid sequences tend to be closely related. Proteins made of amino acids, by the way. The bigger the difference is, the less closely related they are, and the further back they seem to have diverged. DNA and RNA polymerase. These are enzymes involved in DNA replication and gene expression in our cells. They're made of basic polypeptide chains in all organisms, but higher organisms have extra subunits to help regulation of DNA and RNA production. Similar subunits can indicate closely related species. Then there are DNA differences. DNA differences are greater between species which are not closely related. For example, humans, chimpanzees, pretty much the same DNA, almost identical. There are a few minor differences which give rise to the fact that we have less hair than a chimpanzee, that we're a bit taller, straighter backed, bigger brain. But we are undoubtedly very closely related. This can be seen just by comparing our DNA sequences. The same with a horse and a zebra. That's about the difference between a human and a chimpanzee. And we're very closely related. This implies basically that, for example, there was a common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees, which we think was around between 5 and 7 million years ago. And it diverged. It diverged. On one side became the chimpanzees, on the other became modern humans. So if you ever hear the line, which I hear all the time from people who don't believe in evolution, they say, if we evolved from chimpanzees, why are there still chimpanzees? And why are they not turning into humans? Well, because we didn't evolve from chimpanzees. We share a common ancestor with chimpanzees. This ancestor split, diverged. One cousin species became a chimpanzee. The other cousin species became modern humans. Now, the chimpanzee didn't change further because its environment didn't change. You see, organisms adapt to become perfectly fitted to their environments. And once they are, if the environment doesn't change, neither do they. The environment of the modern chimpanzee has not really changed in all those millions of years. Whereas the environment that the ancestors of humans found themselves in did change quite dramatically, which I'll talk about shortly. Therefore, we changed to adapt to that environment. We need selection pressures to push change. This is one of the reasons why, for example, the sea tortoise hasn't really changed a whole lot in millions of years, because its environment hasn't changed a whole lot. Okay, so I mentioned Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands. Well, here they are. You can see different finches with different shaped beaks, all adapted perfectly for their specific food type. They're on their way to becoming separate species due to differing selection pressures on different islands. And this is just the different selection pressures on different islands. You can imagine the very powerful selection pressures over the last millions of years in environments where ice ages have begun to have an effect, for example, and temperatures have plummeted. It's going to be a very strong selection pressure. A dropping of temperature led to the evolution of the woolly mammoth, for example, from the elephant. The animal became bigger, more furry to retain heat. Its ears became shorter to lose less heat. This was evolution. So now let's start talking about human evolution in a little bit more detail. Then I'll go through some of the science of evolution. So humans, chimpanzees, we are cousin species. We shared a common ancestor. Let's go through that process. We don't know everything about this process, by the way, as people that are against the theory of evolution often say. They say, oh, but we don't know this bit in the movement from an ancient chimpanzee-like animal to a human. This little bit is missing. This tiny bit here is missing. Therefore, it couldn't have happened. Evolution couldn't have happened. Well, yes, there are some gaps in our knowledge, but the gaps are getting smaller and smaller and smaller all the time as we dig up more fossils, come up with new theories, analyze more DNA. So we're getting pretty close to filling in all of those gaps. Okay, so evolution and growth of the human brain. So we go back about 3.3 million years ago. This is the time of the Australopithecines, Australopithecus africanus. You may have heard the name Lucy. Lucy was the first of these fossils to be found. And Lucy was pretty much a chimpanzee, but with a little difference. She walked on two legs and her back was straight. Chimpanzees do not. Chimpanzees walk on their knuckles when they're on the ground. They have a bent back. They're quadrupeds. They are quadrupeds, not bipeds. You can tell the difference between a quadruped and a biped just by looking at the spine where it enters the skull. You see, in quadrupeds, the spine goes in through the back of the skull so that the head is straight when you're on all fours. In bipeds, the spine goes up underneath the skull through a space known as the foramen. And this is so that you can hold your head straight when you're on two legs. So Lucy, the Australopithecus africanus, walked on two legs, but otherwise was pretty much identical to a chimpanzee. This was the first divergence, really, between the common ancestor of the human and the chimpanzee. On one arm, we got the chimpanzees and the bonobos. On the other, an entire evolutionary journey took place, which culminated with the evolution of Homo sapiens, modern humans, over 3 million years. Our brains got bigger in this process. We got taller. We became cleverer. We started using tools. We invented fire. And eventually we came up with modern culture. But it was a gradual process. It took over 3 million years. So what stimulated this process? Well, climate change, pure and simple, climate change. You see, on one half of Africa, Eastern Africa, the African Rift Valley has been forming for some time. And on that side of Africa, the climate has been getting drier and forest has been replaced gradually by savanna, bushland. Now, before this climate change, several million years ago, 3 to 5 million years ago, before this climate change, was an ancestral species, ancestor of the chimpanzee and the human, which just lived in the trees, lived in the forest. Now, in the forests, in some parts of Africa, those forests remained, and the creature didn't change much, just became the modern chimpanzee and bonobo. But towards the east, as bushland started to form, the savanna started to form, the forests thinned out, trees became thinner and thinner and farther apart. And these ancestral species, these chimpanzee-like organisms that lived in the trees, they had a choice: adapt or die, adapt or die. They couldn't stay the same. As the trees got thinner, predators moved in to the emerging bush. There were hyenas, there were lions, there were cheetahs and leopards. And these chimpanzee-like organisms didn't stand a chance against these animals. They were fairly safe in the trees, but the trees were getting thinner and thinner, farther and farther apart, meaning these animals had to climb down from the trees, move across a little bit of space to go up the next tree. And they were very vulnerable in that situation. Now, what natural selection does is it works with what we've got. Now, these animals, they didn't have jaws that were anywhere near capable of out-biting a lion. They didn't have claws that were as sharp. They were not as strong. They were not as fast. They didn't have much going for them, but they had some things going for them. One thing they had going for them was their brain. Chimpanzee brains are much bigger and they're much smarter than, say, lions. They also had other things going for them, which I'll talk about shortly. So what selection pressures acted upon them? Well, the selection pressure was trees getting thinner and farther apart, food becoming more scarce, vulnerability to predators on the emerging bush. And how did they adapt? Well, if you get down from a tree, you go across a bit of space and you climb up the next tree and you're walking on your knuckles, you are lower down to the ground. You're less likely to see approaching predators and dangers. But as I said before, there's always variation amongst individuals in a population. Imagine that the odd one of these chimpanzee-like creatures had a posture that was a little bit more upright. Its spine was just a tiny bit straighter. Well, individuals with a tiny bit straighter spine, well, they were more upright and they could see farther into the distance and they were more likely to spot emerging predators, which means they were less likely to get eaten and therefore more likely to find food, grow up big and strong, find mates, and pass on their genes for a slightly straighter, more upright posture to the next generation. And this will occur again in the next generation, and the next, and the next, and the next, and the next. There is a selection pressure for the individuals with a straighter and straighter and straighter back each generation. And over many generations, and the odd mutation that produces an organism that's got a even straighter back than the rest of its population will result in the evolution of Australopithecus africanus, a straight back chimpanzee, basically. So that is how we became upright. We became bipedal so that we could avoid predators and find food. But there were more adaptations. You see, even though we're upright, we are still very vulnerable to predation. But we had one more thing going for us, the brain, the slightly smarter brain. Now, being smart meant we could predict to an extent the behavior of the predators and where food might be found. It's easy to find food when you're in a forest, not so easy in a savanna. So there was no selection pressure to work on this more developed brain and make it even bigger and better wired and smarter. Because the smarter individuals in each generation, they would avoid more predators. They would work out when the predators are asleep, when they hunt, where they hide. So there was no selection pressure in each generation for the individuals with the biggest brain. So over many generations and the odd mutation, brains got larger and larger and larger. So we become more bipedal, brains become larger, we start to grow taller, to see farther and to travel the distance between trees to find food. But one other advantage came our way. You see, as tree-dwelling organisms, our hands were used constantly for climbing. But now we're walking on two legs, and walking on two legs, the hands are now free. So we have these hands that can manipulate objects very well, and they're no longer tied up with climbing. So together with the big brain, we could use those hands to manipulate objects and to start making tools. The first tool was probably the rock. Bands of individuals probably got together to throw rocks at any predators or to smash bones of carcasses open so that they could get the bone marrow out. But over time, as we evolved into Homo habilis, about 2.4 million years ago or so, these estimates are very general, by the way, we learned how to smash rocks up, make sharp points, and use those points to basically attack prey and to maybe defend ourselves against predators. So we got more and more an ability to use tools over time. Homo habilis. But things didn't stop there. We continued to evolve until eventually we became Homo erectus, about 1.9 or so million years ago. Now, Homo erectus was taller, straighter backed, bigger brained, able to use more tools, able to use fire, for example. So we'd evolved the ability to basically use fire to perhaps cook and get more nutrients out of food. Homo erectus, by the way, was one of the earlier of our ancestors to actually spread out of Africa. So Homo erectus evolved in Africa, but moved out of Africa and spread around the world into Europe, into Asia, and changed as it went. So as it inhabited new territories, natural selection, different environments in different territories had an effect, and you ended up with different varieties of Homo erectus, but were quite different in different parts of the world. I'll come back to that in a little while. Okay, but as Homo erectus spread around the world, the Homo erectus in Africa didn't stop evolving. It continued to change. As the savanna changed, as the environment changed, it's changed. By 1.6 million years ago, we had Homo ergaster, larger brain again, able to use better tools, etc. We're still not at the point where we have any culture developing though. Moving forward again, about 1.2 million years ago, we have Homo antecessor. And then by 700,000 years ago, we have Homo heidelbergensis, which isn't a million miles away from a Homo sapien in terms of its brain size and its abilities. It's getting close to a human. It's not a human, it's getting close. I should mention, by the way, that several of these different species existed at the same time. We're used to thinking of evolution like a ladder, with a simple organism developing into something more complicated, till it gets to a human at the top. But that's not how evolution works. It's not like a ladder. It's like a bush with branches going off in all sorts of different directions. And several species of hominids, human-like organisms, existed at the same time in different parts of the world. Much as different species of cats exist now at the same time. We have lions, we have tigers, we have cheetahs, we have leopards. They share an environment. There are different species of hominids sharing the same environment at that time too. Think Lord of the Rings. Think orcs, think dwarfs, think humans, think elves. Okay, so Homo heidelbergensis, which moved across out of Africa into Europe, changed when it got to Europe. So 700,000 years ago, about, Homo heidelbergensis went into Europe, but at the time the weather was starting to change. Ice ages were beginning, a series of ice ages. So Homo heidelbergensis over the next few 100,000 years evolved in Europe and Asia to fit the different climates, and in some cases very, very cold climates. And it gradually became Homo neanderthalensis, Homo neanderthalensis, Neanderthal man. This species, shorter than a modern human, much stronger, much stockier, bigger brain actually than modern humans, ideally suited for an environment during the ice ages. And this organism was found all over Asia and Europe throughout the ice ages. It had quite elaborate tools, buried its dead, possibly had language. It had the right brain structures and vocal cords to perhaps have a language. We don't know, but possibly even had a language. It had spears. It would hunt very big animals, mammoths and things like that. They wore clothes. They were very complex species, perhaps every bit as smart as modern humans. Okay, now Neanderthals existed in places like Europe from about 400,000 years ago. But meanwhile, the Homo heidelbergensis in Africa didn't stop evolving. And about 300, maybe 200,000 years ago, we got the first Homo sapiens, archaic Homo sapiens. Now, these kind of look pretty much like we do with a few primitive features. They were pretty much modern humans, and they spread throughout Africa. But they weren't quite modern humans because they continued to use the same primitive tools that had been used for many, many thousands of years. They didn't seem to evolve a culture. They didn't, for example, make cave paintings. They didn't create all the various artifacts that we find in prehistoric modern humans. So something wasn't quite right, even though they looked like humans, and they didn't spread very far out of Africa. The odd fossil has been found out of Africa of them, but they pretty much remained in Africa, with other species of hominids, such as the Neanderthals, occupying the rest of the world. And they stayed the same for quite a few thousand years, many thousands of years. There was just no change. And then suddenly, about 70, 80, 90-ish, 100,000 years ago, about 70 to 90, 100,000 years ago, sorry, 1,000 years ago, not 100,000 years ago, so about 70 to 90,000 years ago, something changed. There was something about that time known as the cognitive revolution. Now, what is the cognitive revolution? Well, suddenly, about 70,000 years or so ago, we start to see cave paintings. We start to see the production of elaborate tools, much more elaborate than the more primitive tools of archaic Homo sapiens. We see the first religious symbols, for example, a statuette of a pregnant woman. You see this all over ancient cultures, maybe some sort of fertility goddess. And humans suddenly spread out of Africa about 70,000 years ago, and they spread around the world within a few thousand years and replace the Neanderthals and other hominids a few thousand years later. So something happened about 70,000 years ago, known as the cognitive revolution. And we've been theorizing for some time what that revolution was, and also how these modern Homo sapiens replaced the other hominids around the world, some of whom were much stronger than us. Okay, here we see a pattern of spread of humans from Africa around the rest of the world. So we see how these ancient humans spread into Asia, into Europe, as far as Australia. They were in Australia by 40,000 years ago. So we spread very, very quickly around the world from about 70,000 years or so ago. Now, we weren't sure why this happened. Why did humans suddenly become smarter and able to compete with these other hominids? Well, there must have been a selection pressure. We change when there's a selection pressure. For many thousands of years, humans had become perfectly adapted to sub-Saharan African environments. So we didn't change much and didn't spread much. But something must have changed in the environment that forced us to change and the cognitive revolution to happen. There's a number of theories for what happened, but one theory is the eruption of Mount Toba here 74,000 years ago. Now, this was a volcano, but not a normal volcano. This was a super volcano, an extremely massive volcano. And when this volcano erupted, it put huge amounts of ash into the upper atmosphere, which would have changed the climate for at least a year or so. There would have been no summer, no spring, long winters. So without the sunlight, this ash cloud around the world would have caused plants to die. No photosynthesis, no plants. So many plants would have died, which means the herbivores that ate the plants would have also died, and the carnivores that ate the herbivores. Basically, food became very, very scarce over the next year or two. And we think that in that time, most humans became extinct. We estimate that we may have been down to just a population of a few thousand individuals. These few thousand individuals that were left had to repopulate when the ash cleared away and the sun came back and plants and animals and food was plentiful again. But this was a massive selection pressure. Think about it. If most of the food went, then all these archaic humans, or at least many of them, would have starved to death. But who survived out of these archaic humans? Well, the smart ones. You see, any individual that was particularly bright, had a particularly good imagination, would outcompete the rest of the population. And those individuals, those smart, those imaginative individuals could find food where other less smart individuals could not. So they would be able to think back and say, oh, a couple of years ago, there was a food source in the next valley near this particular mountain. And they could go and look there for that food to see if it was still there. Perhaps they could find water sources because they got the memory, they got the imagination to think, maybe there's water there. They could maybe start eating novel food sources which humans had not eaten before. So the imaginative, intelligent humans survived this cataclysm. They survived it because of their brains. The rest of humanity died out. And then this small population of survivors, and it could have been as few as a few thousand, they then repopulated Africa, spread out of Africa and populated the world. These super smart humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, modern humans. And that's why at about 70,000 years ago, we see the spread of humanity, we see the emergence of modern culture, modern tools, and all of these things. Now, this is just a theory. There might have been some other reasons why we became so much smarter, why the cognitive revolution happened, but it's a very strong theory, a very strong theory. Okay, so we all basically are Africans. This is the long story short. About 70,000 years ago, the first modern humans left Africa and spread around the world. So the first Europeans, the first Asians were all Africans, dark-skinned, dark-eyed Africans. And there's much evidence for this. For example, the oldest human remains ever found in Britain date from about 15,000 years ago. The individual is known as Cheddar Man because he was found in the Cheddar Gorge. Now, at first, when they found the skeleton and renditions of him were made, they gave him white skin and they made him look like a modern European. But when they analyzed the DNA of this individual, they actually found that he was dark-skinned, dark-haired, looked very, very African. Did have blue eyes, actually, interestingly enough. So the very first Europeans were African. They looked African. And it's only really in the last few thousand years that the pigmentation in Europeans has become lighter. So this idea of white and black, it's very superficial. The first Europeans, until just a few thousand years ago, looked African, and the same would have been the case with the first Asians. And these modern superficial differences that we have between races, they have only they've only appeared very, very recently. Under the skin, we are all Africans. We are all Africans. Something to mention if you come across any racists, basically. We are all Africans, and even Europeans were Africans until relatively recently. These first humans came into Europe maybe about 45 to 55,000 years ago, and for many thousands of years after that were still African in terms of their appearance. Okay, now let's look a little bit at our DNA. Now, we share more than 99% of our DNA with chimpanzees, but we also share 50% of our DNA with bananas, 75% with fruit flies, 90% with cats. It's the few differences that make in our DNA that make for very different characteristics. So in terms of the different races of humans, we are the same. There's no difference. It's just tiny variations in genes that give rise to different colored skin, hair, eyes, etc. Now, before I move away from human evolution and start talking about a bit more of the evidence for evolution itself, I'd just like to mention the Neanderthals again. Now, the Neanderthals were in Europe. They lived in Europe for many thousands of years, 400,000 years or so. They were in Europe. Humans arrived in Europe maybe 45, 55,000 years ago, but Europe and Asia were occupied by tribes of Neanderthals. So what happened to Neanderthals? Well, a lot of people say that we must have just been smarter than them, outcompeted them, killed them. But the fact of the matter is, humans and Neanderthals, these cousin species, existed in Europe together for many thousands of years. Tribes of Neanderthals, tribes of humans, sharing the same land in Europe and Asia for many thousands of years before the Neanderthals finally went extinct. So what happened? Well, obviously, we weren't that much fitter at surviving than the Neanderthals, otherwise we'd have wiped them out very quickly. But there must have been something, some edge that we had, which meant there was a gradual decline in Neanderthal numbers and an increase in human numbers. And what was that? Well, once again, for a while we were unsure. But then some evidence came to light. When you look at individual tribes of Neanderthals in different parts of the world, you find one thing that's very interesting. The weapons, the tools that they use all seem to be made locally. This tribe of Neanderthals make all of their tools, all of their weapons using local resources. That's not the case with tribes of humans. You may find a tribe of humans in one part of Europe that has tools made from materials which must have been taken from an entirely different part of Europe. So humans, it seems, were trading. Different tribes of humans from very far apart were trading with each other, trading items. So we formed networks in a way that Neanderthals didn't. Neanderthals were isolated populations. Humans made links. We could have had shared culture, shared religion, shared ideas. And this networking gave humans an advantage. Even though the Neanderthals were stronger than us, and probably as smart as us, we could form networks. Perhaps we could gang up against tribes of Neanderthals. We could take the territory. Gradually, this is what happened. Neanderthals eventually died out, round about 30,000 years or so ago. So they went. But did they go? Did they go completely extinct? Well, for a while we thought they did. They just went extinct, leaving just modern humans. But it turns out that isn't the case. We have actually looked at the DNA of Neanderthals. We found fossils of Neanderthals, extracted the DNA and sequenced it. And we've compared it with the DNA of modern humans. And an interesting thing was found. It seems that modern humans outside of Africa interbred with Neanderthals. All humans that are not African, so all Asians, all Europeans, have some Neanderthal DNA in our genomes. Up to 5% of our DNA is Neanderthal, depends on the part of the world. So we are part Neanderthal, we have their genes, we interbred with them. So they didn't go completely extinct. We absorbed them. We are all part Neanderthal. Unless, of course, you are from sub-Saharan Africa, in which case you're a pure human, or much more likely to be a pure human. So Africans, human DNA. Neanderthals never went into Africa, so no Neanderthal DNA in African genome, but quite a bit in all non-Africans. This is again something that racists don't like to hear. They'd have loved it to have been the other way around, but as it turns out, no. Pure humans are Africans. The rest of us are mixed species, let's just say. Okay, but the story doesn't end there. I want to just mention a couple of other hominids. In a part of a part of Russia, small bone fragments were found in a place called Denisova. And when the DNA was analyzed from those bone fragments, it turns out that the DNA of these creatures that lived in very northern parts of Europe in very cold environments were not human, but neither were they Neanderthal. They seem to have been an offshoot of Neanderthals, an organism that shared a common ancestor with Neanderthals. They were named Denisovans, and they're a separate branch again. They seem to have had adaptations which made them better able to cope with the cold and also with altitude. We actually find some Denisovan DNA in some non-African human populations, especially human populations that are better adapted to the cold and to altitude. So there was some interbreeding between modern humans and Denisovans as well. Now, the final thing I'm going to say about the hominids is that even after the Neanderthals went extinct and the Denisovans, another cousin species still existed for many thousands of years. Its fossils were found in an island off the coast of Indonesia known as Flores. And it seems to have been descended from Homo erectus. So Homo erectus spread around the world when sea levels were lower and when Flores was connected to the mainland. So they spread into Flores. Then sea levels rose and Flores became a separate island. And the Homo erectus that found themselves on this island began to change due to selection pressures on that island. Food was scarce on the island. So these Homo erectus adapted. They became smaller and smaller and smaller. And in several caves on the island of Flores, we found these dwarf species of Homo erectus. They were very, very small. They had tools, they had fire, they had the brain of a Homo erectus, but they were tiny. They were named Homo florinensis, nickname the Hobbit. And they seem to exist long after the other species of hominids had died out. It's only when humans finally worked out how to make bolts, etc., and came across to Flores that they were wiped out. So they existed till just a few thousand years ago. There's actually stories amongst the native peoples of Flores of these strange creatures that would come down from the mountains and steal children. That probably wasn't the Hobbit, Homo florinensis, but you never know. You never know. Okay, so now moving on. Molecular evidence for evolution. All organisms share a number of molecular characteristics which suggest a shared origin of all life on Earth. All have DNA or RNA as their genetic material. The genetic code is universal. ATP is the universal molecule for energy storage in our cells. The proteins in all organisms are formed from the same 20 amino acids, despite the fact that there are many more than 20 amino acids available in nature. All of our cells have phospholipid membranes, and vital physiological processes follow very similar metabolic pathways in all organisms. Okay, let me mention now alleles before I move on. You see, we all have two sets of chromosomes, one set from our mother, one set from our father. And a particular chromosome, say chromosome 2, has a particular set of genes on it. Because we have two sets of every chromosome, though, we have two sets of genes. Now, the genes can be the same. They can be identical to each other. For example, maybe your eye color gene on both of your chromosomes is the brown eye color allele or the blue eye color allele. This is known as being homozygous, by the way. But sometimes they're not the same allele. They are different versions of a gene, different alleles. Maybe you get a blue eye color allele from one parent and a brown eye color allele from the other, in which case you are heterozygous. Now, some genes are dominant and some are recessive. Some are co-dominant, but some are dominant, some are recessive. For example, the brown eye color allele is dominant over the blue eye color allele and therefore masks it. If you carry a brown and a blue, you don't usually get blue eyes. You get blue eyes if you have two blue-eyed alleles. This recessive blue eye color allele only shows its effect when you've got two copies. So the characteristic controlled by a dominant allele develops if the allele is present on one or both chromosomes in a pair. The characteristic controlled by a recessive allele develops only if the allele is present on both chromosomes in a pair. We can use this evidence for evolution The evidence can be used to support decisions made about classifying organisms and looking at relatedness. Phylogeny is the study of evolutionary relationships between organisms. Decisions are made using the criteria from the previous slides and other tests as how to group animals. Natural classification groups organisms according to how closely related they are. This should match the evolutionary tree produced by considering how recently organisms shared a common ancestor. Okay, let's talk about genomics. Genomics is the study of all the genes in an organism. By comparing the genomes of different animals, the relationship can be established. Differences between proteins can also be used to establish evolutionary relationships. There are likely to be huge differences between the genomes of different species. Scientists can compare the genes that encode proteins used in important biochemical processes to look at relatedness. For example, hemoglobin. The hemoglobin protein carries oxygen in our red blood cells, and it's very similar amongst most organisms, just subtle differences. But those subtle differences show how closely related organisms are. For example, humans and chimpanzees pretty much have the same hemoglobin, so do horses and zebras. Okay, so let's talk more about natural selection now. There are 3 factors needed for a population of organisms to be able to evolve. First, you need variation. There must be differences between the individuals in a population. Natural selection can only act on a population if there are differences between individual members in that population. Then you need heredity. The differences between organisms must be heritable. For example, if your leg is chopped off, your child isn't born with one less leg. It's not a heritable characteristic. A means of selection, there must be a mechanism or pressure that selects some variables for the next generation at the expense of others. So that could be temperature, food source, etc. So when it comes to variation in evolution, variation can be within a species. Think of all the differences between individual humans. These are known as different varieties of a species. So you can have different varieties of carrot, different varieties of tomato, different varieties of human. This idea that we have of race is, in my opinion, a very stupid term. Black, white, Asian, it's rubbish. We are not separate races. The word race almost implies that we are separate species and that they are very different from each other. We're not. We are just different varieties of humans. Skin color, one person has brown skin, one has pale skin. Well, that's just a different variety of human. You may as well look at eye color and say some humans have blue eyes, some have brown, or hair color. Some have red hair, some have blonde hair, some have black hair. And even within these so-called races, there are differences. There's certain populations in Africa of Africans with blonde hair or with blue eyes. And we have some very dark-skinned populations outside of Africa. Race is a very poor definition, a poor way of separating individuals. Variety is probably a better term, and we come in all sorts of varieties, and most of those varieties overlap. There are more genetic differences within individual groups than there are between them. So we all overlap in many ways. You can see this if you just go to different parts of the world. Some parts of Africa, people are very dark-skinned. In others, they're only moderately dark-skinned. You go into somewhere like India, the south, quite dark-skinned people. The north, much lighter. Go to the east towards China, and you start seeing the formation of epicanthic folds around the eyes, which usually Asian people have. And going to somewhere like Burma, you seem to be in between Indian and Asian. So we overlap a lot. The term race is a stupid term, and personally, I think we should abandon it. So there are differences within species. There are greater differences between species, though, because individuals within species, they can pass on their genes to each other. They can interbreed. Any human can interbreed and produce offspring. So gene flow is constant within a species, but between species, gene flow doesn't exist because they cannot produce fertile offspring. That is pretty much the definition of a species: two groups of organisms that cannot mate successfully to produce a fertile offspring. So there are many more genetic differences between species than within them. When it comes to variation and evolution, variation can be continuous or discontinuous. Continuous variation is variation of traits along a big spectrum. So for example, humans can be 5 foot tall or 6 foot tall or anything in between. We don't come in certain specific sizes. Intelligence can vary along a scale as well. So can skin pigmentation. So this is continuous variation. But we also have discontinuous variation of traits. Certain traits are discontinuous. They come in only certain forms. For example, humans either have an attached earlobe or a detached earlobe. We don't come in between. Humans can either curl their tongue or they can't. You have one version of a gene or the other. This is discontinuous variation. So let's compare the two. In discontinuous variation, there's a limited number of traits with no intermediate forms. Continuous variation, there's a range or gradation of characteristics along a spectrum. In discontinuous variation, it's controlled by a few genes, usually with multiple alleles. In continuous variation, it's controlled by many genes, polygenic. So there are many genes involved in controlling your height, your intelligence, etc. So for example, let's think of intelligence. There might be one gene that gives you a slightly bigger brain. There might be another gene that makes your neurons fire easier or grow easier. Another that allows you to produce greater amounts of a particular neurotransmitter, or have a better blood flow to your brain. So something like intelligence is a result of lots of genes working together. It's polygenic. Continuous variation is polygenic. Always be quite wary when you hear something on the news about the gene for this being discovered or the gene for that. Remember a few years, it was all over the news that the gene for homosexuality had been discovered. If you have this version of a gene, you are gay. It's a gay gene. I find it highly improbable that there is one gene for being gay, that it's a discontinuous trait. This version of the gene, this allele, you're straight, this version, you're gay. It's much more likely to be polygenic because it's a complex phenomenon. Some people are gay, very gay. Some people are very straight. Some people are bisexual. Some people, whatever. And the percentage of populations that have been either gay or straight has changed over the centuries. Look at ancient Greece compared with modern Greece. In ancient Greece, being gay seemed to be just a thing. It seemed to be just a common thing. Like most men in places like Athens or Sparta had sex with men at part of their life and women for another part of their life. They don't anymore. What's changed? Is it the genetics? Probably not. In just a couple of thousand years, it's probably culture that's changed. So, for example, homosexuality is probably a mixture of genetics and environments, all working together in big, complex ways, polygenic. And that's the case with most traits. Discontinuous variation, the environment has little effects on these characteristics. It's hard to push a trait to increase in numbers in a population and to cause evolution to happen if it's discontinuous, if you've only got this version or this version. If you've only got a gene to be good with the cold or good with the heat, it's hard for a gradual change in temperature to affect the population. But if a trait is continuous, then the environment can have a significant effect on that population. Discontinuous traits might include human blood groups. You have blood group A, B, AB, O, rhesus positive or rhesus negative. You're not a bit A or a bit B or a bit O. So it is example of discontinuous variation. Continuous might be stem height in plants, milk yield in cows. It's all about genotype and phenotype. You see, your genotype are the sequence of bases in a particular gene in the DNA. The sequence might be AT, CC, GG, ATTT, CCG, several thousand bases long. That is a genotype for a particular gene. The phenotype might be brown fur. So genotype are the instructions. Phenotype is the trait itself. And genotype doesn't always equal phenotype. You see, you might have a bunch of genes that predispose you to growing very tall. But if you grow up in an environment with poor nutrition where food is scarce, you probably won't grow up very tall. So genotype is affected by phenotype. This probably explains why over the last century humans have been getting taller and taller. Greater availability of certain nutrients in our diet. So genetic variation. Each of these tomatoes is different, not because they are different species, but because they have different alleles for their color. So some are yellow, some are red, some are green. So variation within a species of certain alleles, so variations in the genome, in the genome itself, can basically determine different traits. These are just alleles though. But the environment has an effect too. This flower here, it's the same flower, but it produces a different colored flower depending on the pH of the soil it grows in. So the environment affects the phenotype. Phenotype is a combination of genotype interacting with environment. Another example, here are some genetic differences. These two horses, they could never be the same height. This horse has the genes to be small, this has the genes to be tall. Doesn't matter how much food this small horse eats, it will not grow big because it doesn't have the right genotype. However, if we look at this tree here, this tree looks the way it does because it grew next to a beach in poor quality soil with lots of wind and lots of salt. Therefore, it didn't prosper. If it had grown in a nice, sheltered environment with lots of good quality soil, it would look very different. So its phenotype is affected by the genotype and the environment. And this, by the way, is the case with humans too. We result from a complex interaction of genotype and environment. We may have genes that predispose us towards being aggressive or to being intelligent or to being tall, but we need the right environment to nurture those genes. There was a debate for many years, and it's still ongoing, and it annoys me quite a bit. In the first half of the 20th century, basically the idea was that you're all genotype. It's all about nature. If you carry certain genes, you carry certain traits that are passed from generation to generation. It's all about that lineage. If you're intelligent, if you're tall, if you're strong, that's all just part of your inheritance. And this sort of led to a lot of pseudoscience and the eugenics movement and Nazi Europe. They believed that they should just breed strong, big, powerful humans, the Aryans, the master race. And they could do that. They didn't really understand that a lot of traits are not just about your genetic makeup, they are about environment. So after World War II, there was a backlash against this way of thinking, and the blank slate movement appeared. And for the rest of the 20th century, it was dominant. The idea was that you are all nurture. The human, when they are born, is a blank slate. If they are brought up one way, there will be an artist. Brought up another way, there will be a mathematician. Brought another way, they will be violent and aggressive. Another way, they will be peaceful. But that's rubbish too. That's rubbish too. You see, we are interaction of nature and nurture. You can only be intelligent if you have genes that predispose you to it and an environment that nurtures the intelligence. You need the two together. But for many years, if anyone was to say that actually certain differences in individuals are genetic, then you were called a Nazi and a racist and a eugenicist. But just recently, very recently, this is starting to change a bit. And now people are starting to realize that some traits are genetic, some traits are caused by environment, but many more traits are a big complex interaction between the two. Adoption studies show that many traits are genetic. The behavior and the phenotypes of many individuals that are adopted is very similar to the biological parents rather than the adopted parents. But some traits are similar to their adopted parents. we're about 50–60% genetic in terms of our traits, and the other 40–50% is about environment. Nature and nurture are important. So the origin of genetic variation. Genetic variation is heritable. It is this variation that natural selection acts upon. The causes of genetic variation are mutation and sexual recombination. When it comes to mutation, deletion, addition, or substitution of some nucleotide, some base in the code of our DNA can result in a different trait. So can the translocation, the movement, swapping of parts of our chromosomes. This can happen by random mutation. Aneuploidy, the loss or gain of a single chromosome, or polyploidy, the addition of whole sets of chromosomes can result in new traits or different traits, or modified traits that natural selection can act upon. We also have sexual recombination. There is independent assortment of chromosomes in meiosis. Let me just briefly explain meiosis, very briefly. You get one set of chromosomes from your mother, one from your father. But as a male, you produce sperm. As a female, you produce eggs. And the egg and the sperm contains half the number of chromosomes. Only one of each chromosome randomly goes to the egg or the sperm. And when the egg and the sperm come together, you now have a new set of chromosomes, one set from each of the new parents. This assortment results in new traits, new combinations in the offspring. There's also something called crossing over. Before cell division, before you make an egg or a sperm, homologous chromosomes, so your chromosome 2s, your 1s, your 3s, your 5s, your 10s, the homologous chromosomes line up and swap pieces to make new kind of combinations. So a new chromosome 1 that's a mixture of different bits of chromosome 1 from both of your parents. This again results in new traits. And then there is random fertilization. Who you choose to mate with results in different combinations in the offspring. By the way, we usually are attracted to people that contain traits that we lack, people that have strengths that we lack. This is something we seek out naturally, so that we can make children that have got the best of our traits and the best of the other person's traits, stronger individuals. And this can even be sensed in the mother's womb. The mother's body can detect if the embryo growing is very similar to her, and therefore more likely to contain the same negative traits as her. Some negative traits that could be lethal if produced in a double dose. And you are more likely to have a miscarriage and abort the child if that child is genetically too similar to you. If it's very different, as is the case, for example, in mixed race children, it's more likely to be accepted and the child is more likely to be stronger. You see, all of us carry 2, 3, 4, 5 lethal, potentially lethal recessive alleles, recessive genes. But we all carry a different 2 or 3. In one dose, this lethal gene isn't lethal because it's compensated for by a good gene from our other parent. But if you mate with someone who's genetically very similar, for example, perhaps a cousin, you share the same grandparent, then because you share the same grandparent, if that grandparent has a recessive allele, you and your cousin might both carry that exact same recessive allele, which means your child might have a double copy and suffer some sort of disease, some genetic abnormality. So we select against being too similar. We all carry these 2, 3, 4, 5 lethal alleles, but usually different ones if we are not closely related. The ability of organisms to develop differently in different environments can be genetic. This means organisms can evolve to be flexible. This is one of the things with humans. We've evolved to be very flexible. Not all organisms have. You take an iguana, most of its behavior, most of its characteristics are determined by its genome, not its environment. You take that iguana and put it into a different environment, it probably won't survive. Whereas a human, we have got genes which allow us to be very flexible. That's why humans can eat all sorts of different foods. We can be vegetarians, we can be meat eaters, we can eat fish, we can eat insects, we can live in cold climates, warm climates. We have evolved to be more flexible than many animals, which is why we're so successful. Plants are also a good example of this. The number of leaves, growth pattern, and size of an individual plant is dependent on the environment, e.g. the availability of light and nutrients. When it comes to variation and evolution, many of the differences between species are present because they help the individuals to survive. We call these differences adaptations. You should understand that there are adaptations to anatomy, the anatomy of the body, length of limbs, shape of limbs, etc., physiology or the function of different parts of our body, and our behavior. Because individuals overproduce, yet populations remain stable, competition must take place. In competition, there are winners and losers. Winners are better adapted with more useful characteristics. They are more able to survive and breed, so pass on their beneficial alleles to the next generation. Over time, when this happens continually, accumulated changes can give rise to a brand new species, which may happen to the finches in the Galapagos Islands, for example. Variation in organisms' characteristics are caused by the organisms having different alleles of genes. Some differences enable the organism to survive better, to compete more successfully. The ones with beneficial alleles survive, breed, and pass on their alleles to the next generation. Those without beneficial alleles die before they reproduce, so their alleles are less likely to be passed on. The beneficial alleles therefore increase in frequency in the population and may eventually produce a new species. So selection causes some traits to survive and spread while others are lost. You need a selection pressure for that to occur. If the environment doesn't change for many, many thousands of years, the populations will stabilize and evolution will slow down. But if the environment does change and there's a selection pressure, then evolution will occur. There are three types of selection: disruptive, stabilizing, and directional. Selection can be represented using graphs showing the distribution of individuals with a particular trait. For example, height. Maybe the lowest height humans get to is about, on average, is about 5 foot, and the tallest is about 6'5". Most people will be within the mold, more or less, within a tight range in the middle. Most humans are within a few inches of height of each other. Selection pressures all can change how a trait is distributed. So selection pressure can change the mode. So selection can be disruptive. The selection pressure can push individuals to opposite extremes. For example, the finches on the different Galapagos Islands, some the beaks are getting thinner and longer, some they're getting shorter and stubbier. The trait has now got two modes. Traits can push to opposite modes until eventually you could end up with a different species. Selection pressure can be stabilizing, pushing towards the middle. For example, most babies have got the same body weight, more or less. If babies were too big, women would die in childbirth. If they were too small, the baby wouldn't survive and prosper. So that pressure, those pressures have pushed the mode, have pushed the average towards the middle of the mode. Then selection pressures can be directional. A selection pressure can push towards one extreme. For example, when an ice age occurs and things get colder and colder, the selection pressure might make an animal have thicker and thicker fur and denser subcutaneous fat layers to cope with the cold. So these are different selection directions: disruptive, stabilizing, and directional. Examples: disruptive, Darwin's finches; stabilizing, human birth weight; directional, antibiotic resistance in bacteria. The more they're exposed to antibiotics, the more resistant they get. There are many different selection pressures: competition for food, water, minerals, predation, grazing. Disease is a good selection pressure. In the Middle Ages, the bubonic plague spread through Asia and Europe, killed many millions of people. In one wave, the bubonic plague is estimated to have killed 1/3 of all Europeans, 1/3. But which third did it kill? We were all exposed to it, more or less. It killed the third that were most susceptible, The people that were least susceptible due to genetic differences that made them more resistant to that particular disease, they didn't die from the bubonic plague. And when the bubonic plague went away, they repopulated. There's a reason that the bubonic plague went through Europe a few times within a few years and then stopped. And it wasn't because we knew how to fight the disease. It was because the people left were descended from survivors of previous pandemics of the plague. So they had some resistance. So humans evolved in the Middle Ages. Modern Europeans are descended from the survivors of the bubonic plague. Physical and chemical factors can have an effect on evolution. A good example would be Chernobyl, the disaster in the late 80s where the nuclear reactor in the Ukraine exploded and spread a very large area around it with nuclear waste. Humans were evacuated. The area was abandoned. Many people contracted cancer and died of it because of radiation poisoning. But animals and plants, they were not evacuated from the area. And even though the radiation is still present in the soil, in the water, in that area, animals are still present. And over the years since this disaster, scientists have visited the area and they found something quite interesting. Animals seem to be fine. There are deer that eat the grass. There are squirrels and other animals living and eating the food in the area and drinking the water, and they don't seem to be dying of cancer. They don't seem to be mutated and damaged in any way. Because the animals that were more susceptible to radiation poisoning died of it or got cancer a long time ago. And since then, there have been several generations of animals and a selection pressure of the radiation. And as a result, the animals that are there now have some tolerance to radiation poisoning. They have evolved to become more resistant to radiation. Maybe they have better DNA repair enzymes, for example. So when the DNA is damaged by radiation, they repair it better. Competition for mates is a selection pressure. So is competition for space, nesting sites, territory, etc. An allele that helps an organism compete better is selected for. It increases in frequency. An allele that fails to help an organism survive is usually selected against. It decreases in frequency. Speciation. How does this occur? Well, speciation occurs when there is some sort of reproductive barrier, something that stops members of an original population sharing their alleles freely with other members of the population. If we can no longer mate these different populations, then in each subpopulation, mutations will accrue, natural selection will have differing effects, and you can end up with different species. Speciation can either be allopatric or sympatric. Allopatric is when there's some sort of geographical barrier that separates members of a species, so gene flow stops and speciation can begin. Or the barrier may be behavioral, biochemical, or anatomical. This is sympatric speciation. If some members in a species, for example, develop a different mating call or they're fertile at a different time of year than the rest, then even though they share the same land, they are no longer sharing their genes. This is still a reproductive barrier, but the barrier is created by other means, not geographical. So a formation of new species is known as speciation. Speciation occurs when gene flow has effectively stopped between populations where it previously existed. This requires two populations of the same species to become reproductively isolated. For example, the horse and the zebra. They had a common ancestor. It became reproductively isolated into two populations. One population became the horse, the other became the zebra. Another example, the land that connects North and South America only formed relatively recently. Before that, various fish populations could swim through the gap. They could swim from the Caribbean right across. And as a result of that, a species could mix and gene flow could occur. But once the land barrier formed, you end up with populations becoming separated. And on the two sides now of this land bridge, you have different species of fish, for example, that used to have a common ancestor. For example, the porkfish. When the Isthmus of Panama actually formed, this one primitive population, the ancestor of two types of porkfish, existed in both seas. It existed in the Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean Sea. But when the Isthmus of Panama 3.5 million years ago formed, the population became separated into two groups. And that differing selection pressures and random mutations meant that the porkfish divided into two different species. The Panamic porkfish and the standard, let's say, porkfish. I'm not going to read the Latin names. They are different from each other. They have evolved separately because of a geographic barrier. This is allopatric speciation. Sympatric speciation, when there is no geographical barrier, initially individuals in the original species may have variations that can be divisive for the population, e.g. birds. Some might have slightly different shaped beaks, wings, nocturnal vision, different color plumage, etc. And this can lead to different subpopulations no longer breeding with each other, and speciation can occur. For example, there is a species of grasshopper that lives in the Amazonian rainforest. At least we used to think it was one species. There are a number of them living in the trees, sharing the same environment, eating the same things, looking the same, genetically almost identical. But then some scientists realized that there was actually two subpopulations there that were not breeding with each other. And it turned out it was because one subpopulation had a different mating call than the other. And because they had different mating calls, they were not responding to each other's mating calls, only mating with their own subgroup, their own deme. And as a result of this, despite looking the same, more or less behaving the same, eating the same food, living in the same trees, gene flow would stop. They'd become reproductively isolated. They're technically a separate species. And they will become more and more different over time, just because some mutation changed the mating call. Interestingly, you can actually get them to mate if you put them in a jar together and play the opposite mating calls. And then they do produce fertile offspring. So they can still breed, but they don't. They're a sort of proto-species, basically. Humanity is a selection pressure. Human activity provides some of the strongest selection pressures in the world today. For example, the widespread use of antibiotics has exerted a very strong selection pressure on bacteria. Any that can survive exposure to antibiotics can rapidly divide and produce a resistant population. For example, MRSA is an antibiotic-resistant bacteria. There are more and more antibiotic-resistant bacteria emerging because of the selection pressure of antibiotics created by humans. The limitations of the evolution of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, it's still unclear. Now, I've talked about evolution so far, generally, over millions of years. But evolution can be very rapid, like with the evolution of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, but also other animals, larger animals, can evolve quickly. For example, the cane toad was introduced to Australia in 1935 to control a crop pest, but has since become a nuisance itself. The red-bellied black snake and the green tree snake are highly susceptible to toad toxins. Now, this has caused evolution to occur. So these tree snakes, for example, the tree snake initially, well, tree snakes eat things like frogs. That's what they eat. Now, when the cane toad was introduced, this poisonous toad, the tree snake would eat it and die because of the poison, because of the toxin. They swallow the frog whole, they die. This was a very strong selection pressure. And since 1935, this snake has changed. It's changed over time. It's changed in the following ways. Basically, any snake that was born that happened to have a smaller mouth, a smaller jaw, could not swallow a cane toad and therefore would not be poisoned and would survive. So there was a selection pressure amongst the individuals with the smallest heads. They outcompeted the ones with the biggest heads because they didn't get poisoned. And just since 1935, the heads have got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Completely different sized head now. The ones with the large heads have died out. This is evolution occurring rapidly over just a few decades. So let's talk about inbreeding and natural selection. Artificial selection. In artificial selection, humans decide which members of a population will breed. This allows the alleles for desirable characteristics to be maintained in the population, others to be eliminated. We have been choosing which animals are allowed to breed and which aren't for quite some time with domestic animals such as cows, domesticated animals, I should say, cows, sheep, dogs, etc. We've been changing their traits. We've been acting like nature, choosing who breeds with who. This is artificial selection as opposed to natural selection, where the environment chooses who breeds with who. This technique is used by farmers to increase yields. But artificial selection can lead to inbreeding, which reduces genetic diversity. This can increase the risk of a disease affecting the whole population. And you're more likely to get diseases spreading rapidly amongst domesticated animals than amongst wild animals. Less genetic variation because we keep choosing who breeds with who from a narrower and narrower population. And this occurs in some populations of humans. For example, the Amish, a religious cult in America. All modern Amish are descended from a very small group of immigrants from Holland. And because it's a very small gene pool, as we say, these people are very similar. They're all basically cousins of each other. And this has resulted in a lot of negative alleles accumulating in the population, and they're more susceptible to many genetic abnormalities than the general population. So what is a gene pool? A gene pool can be identified as the total information from all the genes and alleles of the breeding individuals in a population at a particular time. Sorry about that slide. And this is different in different populations. So a particular gene pool might be quite small. For example, the gene pool within the cheetah is very small. The cheetah must have gone through some genetic bottleneck at some point in the past where most of them became extinct, because all modern cheetahs seem genetically very, very similar, which will make them susceptible to many diseases. So population bottleneck occurs when a large genetically diverse population is drastically reduced by a catastrophic non-selective event such as a volcanic eruption. It happened with humans. Our population became relatively small, so the genetic diversity amongst humans, for example, is much less than it is between different groups of chimpanzees. We went through a bottleneck, not a very narrow bottleneck, but a fairly narrow bottleneck. The total genetic diversity of the few survivors is likely to be much lower than that of the original population. As the population reestablishes itself, this low level of diversity will be maintained. For example, the cheetah population has an exceptionally low genetic diversity. This is thought to be due to a very narrow bottleneck where only a single family group survived the last ice age. Which leads me to genetic drift. The smaller the population, the more likely genetic drift will occur. Genetic drift is like this. Imagine each of these bottles is a generation. In each generation, some people will reproduce, some individuals will reproduce, and some won't. Which means occasionally, certain alleles might not be passed to the next generation, or the one after that, or the one after that, or the one after that. Now, in a very large population, this is unlikely to occur very often. because there'll be so many copies of the same alleles spread through the population that it's difficult for a particular allele to leave the population, to become extinct, unless there's a selection pressure against it. However, if you have a very small breeding population, such as a population of people on an isolated island, for example, or within a group that will only marry other members of their own religion, for example, a small group, a small cult, then genetic drift can happen much more easily because you've got fewer copies of that particular allele in your population because the population is small. And as a result, there's a higher likelihood that a particular allele might disappear after a few generations, and that could be a beneficial allele that disappears. So small groups that are not very genetically diverse, genetic drift can have a very strong effect, resulting in a population that are kind of a monopopulation, genetically almost clones of each other, like with the cheetah. Okay, so I hope you found this interesting. And if you are someone that was skeptical about evolution, I hope that the evidence I've provided is at least giving you pause for thought. There's a lot more to evolution and natural selection than I've gone through in today's session, but I think I've covered the basics. So thank you very much for watching, as always. And if you, once again, if you are interested in my material, in my podcast, and you'd like to support me, just go to scienceontheedge.com and click on the donate button. You can actually follow me on Twitter as well. My hashtag is @markofthed, MARKOFTHE, capital D. My website, once again, is scienceontheedge.com. So thank you very much for watching and listening, and I look forward to speaking with you all again very soon. Goodbye for now.